Welcome back, everyone. A little bit earlier, but it gives us more time for questions and discussions at the end. So I would like to invite up Robert Mickens, who will be moderating our part 2, our panel discussion today, and he'll introduce our panel. And I want to remind you all that there will be a roving mic. I'll come around if you have questions at the end, and I'm sure today has given you a lot to think about, and we'd love to have questions from the audience. So please think about questions you'd like to ask our panel, and we'd love to have a discussion with our audience at the end. So I'm going to invite Robert Mickens up. Robert is a Rome-based journalist who has been reporting and commentating on the Vatican and the Catholic Church the past 3 decades.
Mold.
And more. 4 decades.
Three, no,
You
I'm
wouldn't
old.
know it.
I said I'm old.
He is currently the editor of Le Croix International, an online English version of the eminent French Catholic daily Le Croix. Please welcome Robert Mickens.
Thank you. When the Voices of Faith asked me if I would moderate this panel discussion, I was really honored. And I have to say that I've covered the Vatican and issues in the church for a long time. And a little bit of mea culpa. I don't know that I've given enough attention to this particular issue that we've been talking about today and some of the moving and painful testimonies that these women, these courageous women shared with us today. And I have to say I'm very, 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 very moved, and it's changed my thinking, and I hope that those of you who are colleagues in the media will do what we can to make people in the church, especially the people who are in positions of power, understand the gravity, the seriousness of this issue. We talk a lot about the sexual abuse of children, and I think one of the things that was very clear in the days that I spent with these ladies is that there's an issue that we're not talking enough about, and that's the abuse, physical, spiritual, psychological, sexual abuse of women, especially women religious. And as one of the speakers said earlier, this has been known for a very long time. Since the 1990s, the National Catholic Reporter did report on this eventually in the 90s, as did the New York Times. And the thinking at the time, as I remember it, was people in positions of authority in the church said, don't make too big of a media spectacle out of this, because you know what happens in the church. When the bishop or the Bishop of Rome and his curia is or are embarrassed, they retreat. So we can do this behind the scenes, and we'd be more productive in getting a solution. To this date, they've done nothing. And so with that, I want to welcome our panelists today. Most of them have spoken, 2 of them have already given testimonies. ROCIO and DORRIS have given moving testimonies. I'm going to ask ROCIO to come up. You've heard her testimony. Have a seat here.
Thank you.
And I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce the entire panel, and then each one will speak, okay? We also heard from DORRIS. Barb, would you come up here? So you've already been introduced. Have a seat.
Where do you want me?
Have a seat right there, please. Mary HALLAY WITTE is somebody that you've not heard from yet today. We've not heard from. She's from the Diocese of Hamburg in Germany, and she's been at the forefront of bringing about public awareness of sexual abuse in the diocese and in Germany. And she's, like all of our panelists actually, as somebody said yesterday, they're hot potatoes. They give a lot of encouragement to a lot of people, but they also make a lot of people in positions of authority and part of the institution of the church very nervous. So Mary HALLAY WITTE is half Irish and half German. You'll tell by her brogue. The next guest that we have today, the final one, is Virginia SALDANHA. And Virginia is from India. She's from Mumbai. And she's been involved in the Federation of Asian Bishops Conferences. She's worked with the Indian Bishops Conference, and she's also a writer for UCAN and a former chairperson or a board member of Union of Catholic Asian News. And I say that because UCAN pays my salary. We're in partnership with CROIX International. So Virginia, please join us. And we're going to leave one seat. Why don't you sit right there at the end? We're leaving one seat empty, not because we're waiting for Elijah, but in recognition of those women who cannot, are unable to find the courage and the support to speak about the abuse that they've suffered. So welcome to the panel, and I think we'll let one of the newcomers begin. So Mary, why don't you begin with your introductory remarks?
I'm still very moved about your stories. I've been working for 8 years in the Archdiocese of Hamburg to enable women and men to tell their stories and to prevent today children to experience violence and especially sexual abuse in our schools, in our kindergartens, in our hospitals. So it's very moving today to see we're sitting here in Rome and we're speaking up. It's a long path. In September this year, we had the release of a long-term research project on the sexual abuse of minors by Catholic priests, deacons and male members and orders in the domain of the German Bishops' Conference. And it was presented to the bishops in Germany. And I asked myself today, do we really need research to know that sexual abuse is happening? Don't we just need the testimonies of all the women and men who are experiencing sexual abuse? But the results painfully show how structural violence is an imminent basis and a breeding ground which enables the sexual abuse of children and adolescents. And one of the main findings is dealing with clerical power and the associated abuse of power which works deeply within the structures of the Catholic Church. I think we have heard this in your testimonies today. I don't really need to explain this, but it was identified as an important cause and specific structural feature of sexual abuse in the Catholic Church. My personal experience in the reprisal is institutional repression and dissociation are inherent in all issues of abuse. Employees who are responsible providing education, protection and intervention of sexual abuse of children who seek to disclose this perspective of the countless abused women and men within the Catholic Church experience isolation and different forms of structural violence. They suddenly become vulnerable themselves in the attempt to disclose structural violence and sexual abuse. But they need to be resilient and able to work with these resistances against covering up. I think your story has told us about resistances of covering up, disclosing. Violence occurs in the structures in which people work and suffer. It gives us an idea of what we're dealing with, and I think it might be an important point which needs to be addressed in the further discussion. We need to understand what happens. It is more than just discrimination of women or lay people. There is a greater purpose behind it. Clericalism has an effect on ecclesiastical institutions and interaction of all parties involved. Many priests, especially in positions in the higher levels, in their religiously underlined abuse of power, give a testimony which accepts violence, tolerates and does not sanction perpetrators, transferring accused priests to new positions, not complying with state and church laws, are the main symptoms of this testimony. This not only legitimizes sexual violence, but also gives us all other forms of violence its legitimacy and leaks into every tissue of the institution, into day-to-day interactions. It affects people with all the commitments on all levels of church hierarchies. Sexual abuse can only happen within an institution or within a church institution if there also is a fundamental breeding ground on which an offender can rely with his manipulative strategies to initiate and cover up his actions, and where even after disclosure, no protection, sanctions or any other consequences are taken into account. Instead, further violence is continuously inflicted upon the victims, being considered as troublemakers and being rejected. The reviolation of the victims is accepted and, as part of the perpetrator's strategy, serves to secure power. In this way, structural violence again falls back on the victim. Explicit resilience and resistance is needed here for every victim or victim survivor in order not to become a victim again or not to be victimized again. No sanctions in the event of non-compliance with basic rules of human interaction and decency, damaging personal reputation, refusal to work, for example, on the implementation of prevention regulations, open and hidden attacks on individual persons, no sufficient complaint, quality and risk management procedures. All these things are seemingly considered as normal and acceptable, but they do express structural violence and are the day-to-day symptoms within every Catholic institution. In the overarching context, the systematic exclusion of women from church leadership positions, defamation and discrimination of women and victims of sexual abuse, the isolation of those who disclose, who speak and propose the necessity of church reforms is another explicit expression of structural violence. Change of individual actors does not bring about any fundamental change. Abolishing clericalism and ongoing abuse of clerical power within our church structures and addressing necessary reforms require a thorough analysis of institutional barriers of preventing, reporting and prosecuting abuse and the disclosure of structural violence. Its recognition and fundamental change in the attitude by simply returning to the grounds of the gospel. And it requires resilience. Resistance that opposes the temptations of violence and abuse of power. This requires women and men who network and link up, who consciously make themselves vulnerable by opposing structural violence, naming it and disclosing it. This is the only way our church structures can become protective structures in which the rights of children, minors, vulnerable adults and women are respected and the suffering of affected women and men is recognized and abolished.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Mary. I want to move now from Germany to India, to another person we've not heard from yet today. Virginia Saldana has a unique experience, most recently as well, with sexual violence and sexual abuse of women. Virginia.
I belong to the Archdiocese of Bombay in India. I have worked in the structure of the church, as Robert has already introduced me, for about 20 years. During that time, I gave talks and workshops I conducted in my country. And there were several women religious who would come to me and would tell me, Virginia, this is a problem. Can you do something about it? The first reference to abuse was officially put in one of our statements of the first Indian Women Theologians meeting, which I had started as a Commission for Women in India. We just put a sentence over there, and that rattled the hierarchy a bit. But this continued to be a topic of conversation only among women. Since many sisters are the target of abuse, I talked to leaders in congregations, but they all seemed very evasive about giving me an answer or any concrete solution. And I would hear, "We settle it in-house." That was the most I got. Thereafter, I continued to get sisters coming and telling me. I remember once at 10 in the night, a sister knocked on my door and said, "Can I come and talk to you?" And she told me about the extent of abuse in her region in India. The topic came up again when I was at the East Asia meeting of women, which was my last meeting in the Federation of Asian Bishops' Conferences, which was in Taiwan in 2010, and prodded by the Charge d'Affaires of the Vatican, who was present at the meeting. He asked me, he says, "Virginia, what have you done about sex abuse of women in the church?" And I was very surprised that he would ask me that question. So I said, "I think I must say something about it during the meeting." And I told the MC, just encourage the women to talk about this. And there was one sister who told her story about abuse in the church. And since it came up in the meeting, it entered our statement. And of course, our statement was published. And it went all over. Following that, as Robert said, I'm a writer, so UCAN approached me and said, "Why don't you write an article about it?" And since I had so many stories already, I wrote an article. And it was published, and that article went all over the world. And I know that UCAN was pressured to remove that article from the web. It only exists now in bishopsaccountability.org. The bishops were rattled because I told the stories of abuse from different parts of Asia, including India. I decided we needed to take this up seriously. But as soon as I returned from that meeting in Asia, that was the end of my tenure in FABC, and I was, like asking God, praying, what would I do now? I mean, I was so busy, working in all these positions, and now I don't have any of the positions. So what should I work on? When I returned to India, I had a message from a young woman saying, "I need to meet you urgently." I said, "I'm here just for a day and I'm leaving to go for a holiday." "No, I need to meet you urgently." Anyway, I gave her time. I said, "Okay, come." I was leaving that night, but I gave her time. And she came and she sat for 2 hours and she related to me her abuse during a retreat, where she herself, who was already suffering emotional trauma, went for counseling to this priest, and he told her, "Come to my retreat." And the retreat is called Discernment and Decision. And he rapes her and he tells her, "I'm showing you God's love." And that girl was so traumatized because, you see, she went to a priest expecting spiritual and also some kind of advice to help her to come out of her trauma, but he pushes her further into a trauma. And then she struggles with it for a number of years. She finds out that this priest has been raping other girls. She had already gone to 2 separate bishops in the diocese, or 3 bishops, the cardinal and 2 of his auxiliaries, and they did nothing. The priest was told to go to the National Center, Vocational Center for treatment. He was in my parish, incidentally. I would see him coming back to the parish every 2 weeks. And I said, "But where did this man disappear to? I didn't know anything about it." They said, no, he has been told, he's on a sabbatical. I said, "Sabbatical is not like this. You don't turn up in the parish every 2 weeks. Sabbatical is where you go, or you make a retreat, or you do some studies." I got very suspicious, but I didn't know anything about it. When this girl came and told me, I realized I put the pieces of the puzzle together. Then I called together a group because I said I should not be taking this up alone. I knew how dangerous it was. I called a group together and I said, we'll take it up as a group. We already have a women's group there in Bombay. We'll take it up as a group. The cardinal phoned me and spoke to me about 45 minutes on the phone, and he tried to ask me how much I knew about the case. I said, I know whatever you know, because I know this victim has already gone to you. I said, please implement an investigation. Oh, but I'm busy. I said, appoint a bishop. Anyway, we helped him put together an investigation team. The investigation was done. The girl brought a number of witnesses from other retreatants. They gave their testimony. The report was done, presented to the cardinal, and then we kept asking him every month for his response. And he said he sent the papers to Rome and he has to wait for the response. We waited 6 months and we said, you haven't got a response? No, there was no response. We kept putting pressure on him. We sent him a couple of legal letters. He said, but the priest is not listening to me. I've told him to leave the parish and go. I said, do you know, Cardinal, I have stopped going to church because that priest comes and says Mass. I walk out of church when he comes there to say Mass. I can't stand there, sit in church and be present at the Mass that is celebrated by this priest. It troubles me a lot. But the priest was still there. He says he's not listening to me. I said, if it was secular society, if we had gone to the police, this man would have been in jail. But no, he was still there in the parish. Till finally, during Christmas time, I heard an announcement in the church that Father so-and-so is being transferred to the seminary. We thank him for his services in the parish. A group of us women went to the cardinal and said, why did you not tell the parish the truth? Why this man was removed? The cardinal just got up and said, I do not have to give you an answer. Your meeting with me is over. And he walked away. So this is the response we get when we go to the church with issues like this. Thereafter, I suffered tremendously in my parish. I was maligned. I was marginalized. I was told, I heard that the priests were told, do not involve her in anything in the parish. And that was my experience. Then I had another opportunity to work on this issue. There were the sisters who had an NGO. The Holy Spirit Sisters has an NGO in Pune called Srivani, which works for the empowerment of women, started by Father Zeitler, SVD. And they read my article and they said, Virginia, we want to work on this issue. Let us work together. So again, this group that was working with me, we worked with Srivani, and she had 3 consultations on this issue. At the second consultation, we decided to have, get some voices to speak. And we just randomly, one sister who was giving a talk, she said, when I was in one of the seminaries, the idea was there to just ask randomly the seminarians, how many of you were abused? Just write yes on a slip of paper and pass it on to the front. And she said 40% in that class said they were abused as children. So the whole issue of abuse has been there, whether it is in the church, whether it's been in families, but the church has never, ever spoken about it, has never called it a crime, has never called it a violation of human rights, of children's rights, of women's rights. It has been there. We had, after the second consultation, we started making a policy which we decided to present to the CBCI for prevention of further abuse in the church. We presented it in 2013 to the Catholic Bishops' Conference of India. It was only in 2017, September last year, that the Catholic Bishops' Conference in India finally adopted a policy because there was pressure from the government for all institutions to have a policy to deal with sexual harassment in the workplace. And we reminded the church that they are the workplace of the priests. So they finally adopted a policy. Then we had another case, really terrible case of abuse, where 2 orphans were abused by 2 priests in the same parish. Again, they came to us, and we told them, go to the Archbishop's house, tell your story. The first question that was asked to them was, who else have you all told about this? I told them, when they ask you that question, say nobody. And they were told, go back. After 1 week, come back and tell us what you want us to do for you. There was no investigation. The next thing we knew, that priest from that parish was flown out to Canada on a sabbatical. And that is the way abuse cases are dealt with in church. The current case that we are handling right now in India is significant because the survivor nun has taken a very strong stand in her efforts to get justice. For the first time, a sister has gone public about her abuse when the institution failed her. For the first time, a bishop has been named as the abuser. Going public has helped in getting her supporters from the community in her state in Kerala and from different parts of India. But it has also divided the church because there are many who believe the story of the bishop, who says, I never abused her. And there are we people who have the experience of abuse and know that a woman would never come out and make up a story of abuse because it's such a risky thing. It's not something that people can just, dream up one day and say, oh, I want to get this bishop into trouble, I'll say he abused me. Because culture will damn the woman. Culture will blame the woman and really make her suffer. So she's not going to invent a story. We believed her. We support her. We have been helping her. We have written letters right up to Rome, to the nuncio. We have written letters to all the bishops in India, but nobody has bothered to reply to us. Instead, my bishop, who's the president of the conference in India, says, I have not heard of this. The sister has not contacted me. I've only learned about this from the press. But it didn't trouble him. He was so cool about it. It didn't trouble him that there was a woman who was complaining of abuse from a bishop. He was so cool about it. The case has become a very good example to demonstrate how clericalism works in the church, to immunize clergy from any kind of wrongdoing, and to censure anyone who challenges the power of the clergy. I would define clericalism as a power that lays claim to entitlement and privilege with the status of priestly ordination. Together with financial control and spiritual power, it gives an assured immunity from any kind of accountability, as we have seen in all the stories that have come out. And this particular bishop in India has tremendous money power. There was a real case where a priest was sent, in a roundabout way, to talk to these sisters, offering them money to withdraw the case, because finally the sister went to the police. So she was offered a big sum of money with land and building for her to move into if she would withdraw her case against the bishop. So we see also canon law protecting the power of the ordained. And I think it is time that all of us, lay people, the church, Vatican II has told us, the church is the people of God. And I think it is time for the people of God to speak up. We all have to take responsibility for what is happening in the church. We shouldn't stand by and wait for the powers that be to change the structures. That will never happen. We got to call for a change of structures, or we have to begin to change the structures from below. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Virginia. I think maybe, Barb, it might be good for you to jump in. Some of the things that Virginia was talking about, you probably have had some experience with hierarchy, more probably than any of our panelists here. Barb has, as you heard before, I don't know, she didn't talk a lot about her experience with SNAP. She talked about her personal experience as a survivor of abuse. But Barb was very much involved in the Survivors Network of Abuse by Priests, and they were blamed a lot, and they were not believed for so long. As Virginia said, and others have said, the institution has tended to doubt the testimony of the abused. That perhaps is changing now as the crisis is showing itself to be a universal and not just limited to certain geographical or linguistic areas. But Barb has taken on the hierarchy. Why don't you begin with your remarks now?
Well, I have to say, listening to the people before me, I'm sitting in my mind mentally crossing off paragraphs going, whoops, she covered that one, whoops, we covered that one. So remember from this morning, I'm a gym teacher. We're not known as a particularly eloquent group, so as my children would say, I'll give it a go. I see amazing people sitting in this room, people with talent and scholars and research and organizations. And the very fact that you're here is encouraging, because it's going to take great minds to make this change. In my years working with SNAP, for the majority of it, I was the outreach director, and I talked to thousands and thousands of survivors, family members, and our supporters. I watched survivors risk everything, their reputation, their jobs, their families, because they wanted to expose the predators. And by exposing the predators, you protect the kids. I watched survivors, like Virginia said, turn down enormous amounts of money because they would not sign the settlement agreements until the documents were released, the documents that exposed the cover-up and the corruption within the hierarchy. I think you need to remember that SNAP, at its high point, had three paid employees. Everything was done by the volunteers. They are the ones who've done the majority of the work. And when you think a group of volunteers has taken on one of the most powerful and wealthy countries, or religions, organization countries, it's pretty amazing. And they have ever so slowly forced them to change. We wouldn't be here where we are now without the journalists who've done the research, who've exposed the corruption, who refused to be silent. And just now in the United States, we're seeing the civil authorities begin to say, crimes are crimes, no matter what your title, what your uniform, who you belong to. And those are all very encouraging things. A woman of my age was raised that we are ladies and we don't get angry. But I'm angry and I'm frustrated. How in this day and age can we let women and children be sexually assaulted by some of the most respected and powerful men in our community, and there are no consequences? And I also think we need to consider the fact that while all sexual abuse is horrific, when it's done by a member of the clergy, there's some added dimensions. Most of us were raised as very devout children. The church was our place of safety, our place of refuge, where you went when you needed help. And somehow the perpetrators destroyed that and wound God into the abuse. I believe there's predators in every segment of society. Probably always have been, probably always will be. But where the Catholic Church has failed is in what they do when they catch one. If they remove the priest when they first were notified that he was a predator, there might have been 1 or 2 victims. But when you move them from parish to parish, diocese to diocese, country to country, they often end up with 50 to 100 victims. I'm going to keep harping on the fact that we need to use proper language. The church has created some of the most fascinating terms for sexual abuse. Boundary violation, father was too friendly. Misunderstanding, I'm not entirely clear how you misunderstandingly rape someone, but it seems to be there. Cultural differences, relationship and affair. We need to call it sexual violence. We need to call it crimes. I feel the real reason church officials have chosen, and there's another key word, chosen, not to take action is because all their needs are being met. There's no incentive to change. There are no bishops rotting away in jail. Almost nobody's lost their title, their salary, and their job. They're still treated with deference and respect. Money continues to pour in. Why would they change? Everything's going their way. And it is a choice, and they are choosing not to change. It's been almost 17 years since this latest explosion on the sexual abuse of mainly children. But we're still waiting for the church officials to take action. We're still hearing policies and procedures and research and commissions. I'm sorry, how long does it take you to figure out it is wrong to sexually assault another human being? Most of us were born knowing that. 2 weeks ago, the United States Council of Catholic Bishops was meeting in Baltimore, and they had on their agenda that they were going to vote on how to sanction their fellow bishops for cover-up. The Pope asked them to wait 3 months until they were meeting here in Rome in February. That may not sound like a lot to you, but if you're a child being sexually assaulted, 3 months is an eternity and completely unnecessary. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Barb. I'll just remind our audience that the 2002 is often the date that people use to locate the beginning of the sexual abuse crisis. That's actually very late. It was in the early 1980s, at least in the United States, where journalists, especially and particularly at the National Catholic Reporter, under the direction of the editor Tom Fox and the reporting of Jason Barry in particular, did a widespread coverage of cases in Lafayette, Louisiana. And since 1985 to 2002, the bishops again took their time and did not do much. And it was only in 2002 with the Boston case that it exploded. And now we're in this next wave since the allegations and the whole case of former Cardinal Theodore McCarrick and the abuse that he's been pretty credibly abused of perpetrating. So just want to keep that in mind, that this is not something just from this past summer or from 2002. It's something that has been around for a long time, and I think that we can understand and empathize much more with the frustration of the groups that have tried to bring this forward. And again, I would remind you all that they have been, and Jason Barry has been, and Tom Fox and NCR have been much maligned along the process for being out of line and trying to cause problems in the church. I would just ask you to keep that in mind, because now here we are in 2018, and we're still not at a resolution of the problem. Rocio, now it's your turn to make some more comments. Thank you.
Yes, I would like to share with you a little bit about the research that I'm doing now. I have been, over the last 4 years, my research focus has been about theological and pastoral responses for survivors. So I have been interviewing victims. And I wrote a report with Professor David Toombs at the University of Ottawa in New Zealand. And we realized that there are a lot of studies about the psychological consequences of sexual abuse, about the physical consequences of sexual abuse, but very little about the spiritual consequences of sexual abuse. And one of the most common justifications that you hear from prelates, clerics, and people of the church for minimizing the crisis is that sexual abuse is not just a reality within the church. It's all over, it's in the different institutions. But I think that this shows that we don't understand the special characteristic of clerical sexual abuse. Is not the same. Why? Because one of the key features of the sexual abuse committed by clergy or lay consecrated people is the spiritual power used to seduce a minor. The priest or pastor represents the voice of God and the love of God, and to be betrayed by one of the representatives has enormous consequences on the faith of the victim. In our research, interviewing survivors, we have confirmed that the consequences have been terrible. The abuse affected their own identity. Most of them were Christians, and the faith modeled their own person, their own identity as people of God. They questioned God's benevolence. They had a crisis of faith. They experienced a profound loss of spirituality, and they transferred all their feelings of anger towards God, as if God was the perpetrator. The church became a desecrated place because it's the place, and they will never walk again, is the place where they were abused. So what is important to understand is that in clergy sexual abuse, we have a combination of sexual abuse with spiritual power. When we talk about clericalism, it's not just about governance power. We have created just one and only one caste in which the priests have this huge spiritual power. They are the only ones who authoritatively represent God. We need to leave this old theology of priesthood. The concept of ontological transformation that happens in the ordination, as if it were a magical effect on the sacrament, is wrong. Clergy are not superheroes. They are not transformed in the day of ordination. They don't become holy. They are not other Christs. The majority of the people in the church are laity. Priests cannot exist without laity. Priests exist to serve the laity. And I think here we have a problem when we talk about spiritual power, because also Vatican II and Christi Fidelis Laici define laity as the one we have the mission, we lay have the mission to go to the world, to evangelize the world, because we are in the world. And my question is, and where are the priests? Where do they evangelize? In Saturn, Jupiter? What is the definition of priest if the lay, their mission is to be in the world? It's because the problem is that we have been defined in relation to priests. So they are the sacred, I don't know what is this sacred dimension, as Chitina told it, and we lay are the ones who are in the world. It's wrong. All of us, priests and laity, all of us are in the world. And all of us have to do that this world becomes sacred, that had the presence of God. So that division between laity and priesthood is wrong. The theology, the ecclesiology is wrong, and we have to change it. Another research that I have just finished now, in also at Ottawa University, is about, we have been investigating the idea, a very scandalous idea, but I think it's absolutely real, that Jesus himself was a victim of sexual abuse. Because you have to think, crucifixion, it was not just the goal of the crucifixion. It was not just about a practice imposed on prisoners, not just to kill them. They wanted to humiliate sexually the prisoners. And it was very common in the Roman Empire, in the Jews, also the Jews, to always, when they wanted to humiliate a victim, to put him naked, because they wanted to sexually humiliate the person. Because they know that sexual humiliation is a weapon for power, for demonstrate power over the one who is over this power. But we Christians, we have always, put the loincloth on Jesus on the crucifix. Why? Jesus was sexually humiliated, facing a mock of people, laughing at him, naked. And we have covered him. And we wanted to ask the victims, what do you think of the idea of Jesus as a victim of sexual abuse? So it has been fascinating, the answers of the survivors. All of them have said, it's historically right, it's realistic. We need to have this image because it's the real Christ that has suffered also sexual humiliation. But they said something, and I asked them, do you think it will help survivors? The answers have been very different, and they said, well, it will not be helpful for the ones who are not Christians. It will be helpful because he will come one of our guys. But they said, no. The ones who need to recognize that Jesus also suffered sexual humiliation are the clerics and the wider church. Because if they understand that Jesus himself was also a victim, they will not treat victims as they have treated us. They will put victims in the center of their worries and pastoral response. But they said something more interesting. And they said, but it will be very difficult because if the problem of the church, because also we have to understand why it has happened. So first is the clericalism that we have talked, the spiritual power, this division between lay and clerics, this organization that is a club of male, that the church is breathing just with one lung, masculine lung, so suffocating. But the other question is about the idea of sexuality. So the victims told me something very interesting. They said, they will never, that's why they put the loincloth, because all the history of the church, if they are not able to talk about healthy sexuality, they will never be able to talk about its perversion. So, I think that one of the problems is that we have had a terrible vision about the sexuality, always equating, and that's a problem also, that we have equated sexual abuse as a sin, but not as a crime, but as a sin against an offense to God. So of course, if a priest committed a sin, an offense to God, just he was forgiven in the confession, and he was removed to another parish. Why? Because we have not seen that the problem are not, the sins is not an offense against God, is the harm we do to others. And if we don't understand that we are evaluating always sexuality in terms of acts, also we have to change the moral, the ethical Catholic moral. It's so wrong because we are always judging, it's a fixation about sex, and we are always just judging acts, and we are not talking about the harm done to the people, to the victims.
Thank you, Rocio. Thank you. That was said by a former official of the Roman Curia.
Former.
You worked at the Pontifical Council for the laity
Yes.
from how many years?
5 years.
5 years.
Yes.
Okay. So we've got a rich group of people here today from different parts of the world where the whole idea of sexual abuse within the church and even within society has been dealt with differently in at different speeds, according to different customs and traditions of As Virginia was saying, a woman would not, in India, would not dare to make an accusation like this, because this sister is stuck in her convent, I believe. She's not left the convent.
No.
Because she's
like
afraid
almost
for
like
her
a
life.
prisoner over there.
In other countries, maybe, you know, you saw in the United States, maybe the confirmation hearings of a Supreme Court justice where a woman came forward, and many thought that that was very courageous. Others said no. In the United States, maybe not, because compensation is lucrative, and maybe she was looking for money, or that would not happen in India. So we've got different things going on. What we want to do now is try to figure out let's start our little conversation with this bit of this tidbit. Pope Francis has gathered the presidents of all the world's bishops' conferences together in February to look at the abuse of minors. That's its broad title. It's not very specific. He's got a panel, a committee that he's set up with Father Hans Zollner, a Jesuit, who's well known for working on preventative measures, works at the Gregorian University's Institute on Sexual Abuse, and some other people working on this committee to prepare the meeting. What, if you could make one suggestion to the bishops, keeping in mind that, again, we're talking a universal response here. I don't know what they're going to achieve. But if you had one thing to say to Pope Francis, what would you say to Mary? What would you hope from February?
And listen to survivors. Listen to survivors. To listen to the survivors' stories and let your heart be touched by this. And then you know how you have to act.
So your suggestion perhaps would be that survivors address the Pope and the bishops at this meeting?
Right. Talk to the bishops at this meeting. Let a woman be invited and tell their stories. We had it today, and we know the experience of how emotional, and you think you have to act, and it changes your view on everything.
Barb, what would you ask for the February, a concrete proposal perhaps for?
I would suggest that they understand that they're discussing criminal behavior. We're not discussing the tenets nor the beliefs of anyone's religion. And that if my car is stolen, I don't call the bishop and say, hey, bishop, can you get my car back? Well, if you've been raped or sexually assaulted, you need to call the police. And I don't think it's the church's place to investigate. And if these internal investigations the past 40 years are any indication, they really stink at it. So, you know, to me, there's no need to discuss it. The need is you abide by the laws of the land, and criminal investigations are carried out by independently, professionally trained law enforcement, not your bishop.
Virginia, you expressed concern to me yesterday about one of the members on the organizing committee, the preparatory committee.
Yes, one of the chief organizers is my bishop from India. So I was asking myself, what will he contribute? More cover-up ideas? What's going to come out of it? I think I agree with Barb that we have to now tell survivors, go to the police, because this issue is being taken very seriously in the civil sphere. And violence against women is a worldwide issue, and I think governments are being pressurized to take action. And they are taking action. I know in my country, they're taking action because there is a lot of pressure, even from women's groups, secular women's groups. So we need to take action where we will see results. We have waited decades. Actually, this is a sickness in the church that's gone back centuries. We just need to read church history. And they have happily kept it covered, but not in this 21st century of communications. It's no longer, it's just explosive. It's like a powder keg waiting just for a spark to, and I think that spark is already lit.
Rocio, you said that you took your concerns to the Peruvian government, state officials, and they did nothing. Has that changed, do you think?
Well, yes, because now in Lima, for example, now they are investigating Sodalicio, and because of the case of Sodalicio, now the Congress have decided to change the laws. Because in Peru, I don't know, it happens also in other countries, after you committed a sexual crime, after 10 years, you are free. You are not able to be you are not able to go to jail. So now the congressmen, they want to change, and the civil, you're asking me about the civil, no dimension.
Right.
So they want to change and put the laws so you can, because we know that usually survivors talk after 20, 30 years when they are in their 40s or 50s. No? So that's a good thing. They are doing, now the Congress, they are doing, and the General Attorney, they are doing an investigation against Sodalicio. And also, they are giving proposals for changing the laws. That's a positive thing that we needed in Peru.
That's on the state level. On the church, we talked about clericalism a lot. That came up today as one of the elements to this whole tragedy. And it's one of the elements, it's the key issue identified by the Pope in his letter to the people of God in August. He identifies clericalism as being at the heart of, and he's very clear, he's not talking just sexual abuse, but abuse of power, spiritual abuse. I mean, and I think that's important that we keep that in mind, that these are, we sometimes I think get bogged down in saying the abuse of children, and they always say they're mostly little boys, and that, Barb, we were talking yesterday, you said no, in the United States, what are...
We felt in SNAP 40% of the victims were girls.
40% were girls. We don't hear that often, I think, in the United States. The image that I think that the picture we've been given, at least by a lot of people in the church, and especially bishops, is that these, and most recently, by the former prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, Cardinal Gerhard Müller, says that these are mostly teenage boys.
Well, but that's part of the smokescreen. Because if you say the victims are teenage boys, then it's a homosexual problem.
Exactly.
And it's not. Homosexuals are less likely to sexually assault a child than a heterosexual. But now they've got everybody talking about homosexuality, and all of a sudden we've missed the real topic, which is children, boys and girls, are being sexually assaulted. So I think we need to keep our focus on what is the problem itself and not kind of these smoke screens.
What other smoke screens do you see that need to be eliminated?
Well, 2 weeks ago, before coming here, a priest approached me, and he was a little bit angry with me because I published an article asking for the defrocking of a priest, that he was already in jail, and that survivors in New Zealand were asking for the defrocking of the priest. So he said, Rocio, but defrocking is not the solution. And I said, well, it is. I said, if you commit a crime, you are not able, and you must not continue being a priest. But these are the ideas that I say, these are the unhealthy ideas that we have to change. So first, because this priest told me these ideas, we have to ask the victims for forgiveness. So we want to silence victims asking for forgiveness. And I say to myself, a perpetrator can never demand forgiveness, because forgiveness is a free act, so you cannot, the forgiveness is not the point. First, we need justice to build forgiveness. And we as perpetrators, as representatives of the church, we cannot demand forgiveness. Second, he said, it's the problem of the moral failure of some individuals. It's not all the church, because there are so many good priests. Again, no, it's a systemic problem, because it's not just about perpetrators. It's a system that has enabled for decades and decades the sexual abuse crisis. So it's not an aberration within the system. It's an aberration that is fluid through all the system because of this club that protects, clubs of boys that they protect themselves. So third, he said to me, no, but it's so, because we were dialoguing and he was saying all these reasons. And he said, well, but also that was a problem of the past. And is in the past, now we call it crime, but in the past it was not seen as that. It's not true. Okay, it was not seen as that, but we have to call it now with its name. And we can judge the past with our eyes now. So it is a crime. So I think that really it's needed to change these unhealthy ideas. We try to justify as saying, oh, but it's a problem of all the institutions. No, it's very different, the problem within the Catholic Church, because we are talking about what we said, this spiritual power, this sacred power, that makes all the dynamic absolutely different. So I think we have unhealthy ideas and an unhealthy culture. Because if we continue with the lack of women not just in the, I think, of course, we need to have leaders in the system, in the different governance system, but also I think it's not possible that the only ones who can represent God are the priests, the male. So we women have no voice to proclaim the gospel. I'm not saying, look, just deacons. Why? What would be a liturgy in which women also are represented, in which we have a prophetic voice and we can do a homily? What would I have the dream of a mass in which we will be a priest and a woman preaching. Why not? And I'm not talking here ordination. I'm talking just a little change.
As perhaps a woman to proclaim the resurrection, for example.
Exactly, just
like Mary Magdalene, the first one to
like in the primitive church.
I think you've hit on a very, very important issue that we've not talked an awful lot about. We've been talking about the experience of being abused, but we've not talked about the role of women in helping the church resolve or address the problem of abuse. One of the things that really has always struck me as kind of odd is that at the beginning of at least when in 2002 in the United States, when the bishops met for their big meeting in Dallas and came up with their charter, they didn't involve any women in this. And I mean, for all that John Paul II talked about feminine genius, I mean, if there's one thing that there's a feminine genius about, you can argue the points of this vision, but one thing is women are mothers, men are not. And the motherly instinct of a woman, especially when children are vulnerable and abused, I think there was a missed opportunity personally. But where can we logically, as the church moves at glacier speed, what would be the first step for women to be involved in decision making? How would you see women being involved? How could you convince the Pope in a way that he could accept without, pissing off 10 more cardinals that already dislike him?
I would just ask him, look at Jesus. What did Jesus do? I really feel that the church has digressed from the message of Jesus. They've lost the message of Jesus. They've got wrapped up in empire from where they were given birth. The church got its birth from empire. And they've got so involved and wrapped up in that pomp and show and trappings of empire that they have lost the message of Jesus. And I would beg the church to go back to the message of Jesus, to read the Gospels carefully and see how Jesus involved women. You just spoke about Mary Magdalene being the first messenger. The woman at the well brought a whole village to Jesus. Is there any example in the Gospels where a man brought any single person to Jesus? There are women who brought people to Jesus. Women are the best evangelizers. But where does it looks like the church has lost all this, or they just don't know about it, or they just don't care about it. So I would just tell them, just go through the Gospels and go back to Jesus and live the values of the gospel and the values that Jesus gave us. And I think they should begin with this synod, or whatever they call it. I don't know whether it's a synod or a meeting. Get sufficient number of women involved. Yes. Women who are already been involved in working on this issue. Sufficient number of survivors. And I think unless there are 50% of the people of God present there, survivors and advocates, together with the bishops, nothing is going to change. It's just going to be another boys' talk shop. Okay. I don't think anything is going to change.
Mary.
I would like to add, I'm not a bishop, I'm not a priest, I'm not a victim. I am a lay person working in the church, seeing what's happening. I have seen the files, I've seen what's happening. But there are lots of people like me who don't believe. It's the bystanders we also need to address, and we need the support of the people in the parishes, in the communities, in the schools, the other teachers who say, I don't believe that this man did this, or that this woman did it. We need more people to support the ideas of what we're talking about today, and not just stay there and say, okay, fine, here comes Mary again, yeah? She's nagging in everyone's heels. No, we need people to support all the people, and not only the bishops, not only the priests. We need all the faithful in our parishes and everywhere we are.
I would like to add that I think it's very important what you are saying about the bystanders, because there is a theologian, Havens, he says something very interesting, that the problem of sexual abuse is not just a problem of the victims or just a problem of the perpetrators, but it's a problem of the community in which all the communities involved and the bystanders have a very important role, because the bystanders sometimes they don't know what to do. Sometimes they remain silent, sometimes they remain angry, sometimes they don't know, or they just don't do anything, or just they are tired of hearing the stories. While the bystanders is the majority of the church, because not all of them, not all the people of God have been abused or are perpetrators. So if the bystanders stand up and take action, I think that will be a very, we need that, we need.
I want to move to a slightly different aspect of all this, and that is reconciliation. It seems to me that we never get to a point, I don't know, maybe Barb could address this, maybe Rocio, you too. People who are survivors of abuse, sometimes it seems that they can never get to a reconciliation. I talked to a psychologist once, and he said, you get so far, and it's the most difficult point is that other phrase where people can move on with their life and bring about reconciliation. I think of something I've recommended, something similar to a truth and reconciliation process like they had in South Africa over apartheid. But there is that a possible way? Just untangle that a little bit about, can we get to, as you said, you can't demand someone forgive.
No.
But we know, I think, spiritually, that unless the person that is wrong comes to a point of forgiving, that person is not free, and the person who's done wrong cannot be free. We're in a bind until there's a reconciliation. How possible is that?
I do think it's possible, but I think the problem for many survivors has been that they believe forgiveness means, okay, you know, you hurt me, it's okay, go away, no big deal, I forgive you. But forgiveness does not mean there's no holding them accountable. There's no justice in it. And I think if survivors understood better that I can forgive the perpetrator, but it doesn't mean I don't want justice, I think there would be more forgiveness. I think our problem has been in defining forgiveness.
Absolutely.
I think that my understanding of forgiveness goes hand in hand with making amends. Its reconciliation goes hand in hand with making amends. And amends can be made only when they see that the church is serious. Up to now, the church has not shown any seriousness about addressing this issue. Of course, this meeting is called and they make a big issue of it, but what comes out, only God knows. So therefore, we need, I think at this meeting, that's why I'm asking that there are sufficient number of people equal to the bishops whom they will listen to if they're really interested in a solution. There can be no reconciliation unless the survivors see that the church is serious. They're really serious, and I think survivors will see the church is serious when they see enough of people over there being listened to and involved in the whole process, right up to bringing out the final document from this meeting. I think there has to be that involvement. So reconciliation means making amends, and making amends means bringing out all those files and saying, yes, we have so many. The church up to this day has not admitted this wrong. Please let us be clear about this. Up to this day, the church has not admitted that it has done any wrong. It has not admitted. They keep finding excuses why they don't act. They just keep finding excuses why they don't act. And they invent excuses. And that's so frustrating. And that's so hurting to victims. In India, I know many victims who've just been married off, and they think that's a very good idea. They don't care what happens later on in the lives of that couple. And that's not right. That's really not right. I think the church has to go back to the message of Jesus. The church has to show seriousness that it wants to address this issue. And up to this day, as an advocate, I have not seen seriousness about this. No.
In your experience, would you agree with that? Have you found people that are serious, or are they getting serious in Germany?
I have the feeling that in the German church we're very far away from asking this question. That we have to do our homework first before we actually, in the process, can ask this question. I told my bishop, the results are coming out. You don't say, please forgive us. Just say, I'm sorry. And I have my responsibility in this part. And he said, that's like going to confession. I said, yes, that's like going to confession.
It was that difficult for him to...
It was very difficult for him. But he did say sorry then, in the end. But I think we're far from that. We have to do so much homework in working out what has happened, in saying, yes, it has happened.
Yeah, that's okay.
As the bishops, not only a handful of young bishops, all the bishops in the bishop conferences have to cop on and do their homework.
I think also one important element for this forgiveness is to, one of the most profound wounds of the survivor is the betrayal of trust. Okay? They have been betrayed in their trust. So the only way to reconcile them or help to reconcile them is to find again that trust. But if we, as church, we don't do anything, the problem is that they feel re-victimized. When we don't listen to them, when we make justifications, when we cover up, when we give promises and we do nothing, they are re-victimized and they cannot forgive. I think, of course, forgiveness is the goal. But what I think is that first we have to do our homework, we as church, because for example, I have a very good relationship with survivors, and they know that I am a Catholic, and they feel that they can trust on me, but they don't feel the same with other people from the church. So because they feel that I am on their side, that I am really centered on them, I think that's the way of reconciliation, because they can feel again the love of God from someone who belongs to the Catholic Church. For me, reconciliation has a countenance, has a face, and we have to be that face.
Interesting. The face right now is a male face in the church. I want to ask you each what concretely can women bring to this, and what roles should women be playing in the abuse crisis right now? What does a woman bring, do women bring that men cannot or are not bringing to this right now?
Well, I think as we don't have power, we don't care too much about the institution or the image. I think that we women are more rebellious than men. Men always protect the law, the institution, they are always worried. We don't care. We want to protect the vulnerable. So I think that's one of our virtues. Strengths, yeah.
But in what concrete way could women get involved, could be employed? Because unfortunately the people who hold the strings of power are the men.
Well, I'm always careful in saying now the women must come and clean up the mess the men did. Yeah. In Germany, everyone is screaming now. Oh yes, the women have to go into how do you call it? The training to become a priest, and they have to do this and that. And I said, well, okay. 5 years ago, they said, well, women have to come into leading positions in the church, and the people who have been prepared are kind of leaving the church at the moment. Yes, of course, we had 2,000 years' time to be part of this church, and I don't think it's only the solution that the women are coming now. There has to be far more, and we're coming in with maybe our sensibility for life because we give birth, but men are fathers and they should have the same sensibility for life and to nurture and to, protect life. So I'm kind of more critical at the moment about these voices of saying, oh, we need the women now to, clean up this mess. Yes, we can clean up mess, but then we're in our role again of, in the background, we're always cleaning up and doing the cooking. So I think we have to come into
balance.
Into balance and into saying all the resources, all the wisdom we bring, that we are courageous women, and that we bring up the kids because we're the ones who, bring up the kids and to make society a safe place in the world and hand on love and Christianity.
Interesting point. I didn't think of it that way, and I didn't mean to suggest that women now have to come in and clean up the mess. But taking a role, a leadership role. What kind of leadership roles? We can leave aside for a moment, the question of ordination. But what would you like to see, or would you like to see women in particular roles in drafting or coming up with the solutions to this?
Like I said, again, I would like to say that the women should be there present in that meeting. The women should be 50% involved in decisions, voting, 50% involved in drafting the document. Okay? They have to recognize that women have the talent, women have the capacity and capability of contributing in this. They have not done a good job so far. They have done no job so far. They've just kept the structure of patriarchy going. They have not done a job at all.
I'm going to come back to that in a minute because it goes to clericalism as well. And I would recommend a very, very good, if you're trying to scratching your head and think, well, what exactly do you mean by clericalism? A very good article that I found extremely informative was published in 2002 in America magazine. It's a Jesuit publication in the United States by a man named Russell Shaw, who was the public affairs officer for the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops back in the 80s for a number of years. That article was brought to my attention again just last week, and it was written 16 years ago. It's hard to believe because rereading it, it could have been written this morning. And it starts off by saying clericalism is like the wallpaper. It's all blended in so much that we don't even recognize it for what it is anymore. And I would contend that we're all involved in promoting the clericalist culture. Lay people, I have said many times, you don't have to wear a Roman collar or a religious garb to be a clericalist. That we put priests on pedestals as clericalism. So I would just suggest that if you're interested, because people, have strange ideas or confusion about what clericalism is. America Magazine, Russell Shaw, it's called The Abuse Crisis and Clericalism, 2002. I want to thank you. Do you have some final words to say? Yes, we do. Chantal Getz. Of course.
So thanks so much. We just want to introduce our final speaker, Chantal Gertz, whose vision has brought Catholic women from across the world together for the past 5 years to fight for and speak out against for structural change and gender equality in one of the largest patriarchal institutions in the world today, but one whose membership is over 60% female. Chantal is the Managing Director of Voices of Faith and the Executive Director of the Fidel Gotz Foundation, a lawyer, a fighter, a mother and a Catholic. Chantal has seen firsthand the work women are doing on the front lines of the church for refugees, for remote communities, for social justice. Women are the church, and we are leading where it is most needed. So why are we not invited to lead in collaboration with those at the highest levels and ranks of the Catholic Church? It is a question of inequality, and one that has led Chantel down this ever-growing rabbit hole, and one that each day takes us a step closer to reform. Please make Chantel feel very welcome.
Thank you, Stephanie. Too much honor. I promised my speaker 6 o'clock is our goal, to have a good glass of wine and let all the emotions go. We're finally there. It's been really emotional these past days. So I thank you, all of here at the audience. You came to listen, to learn, and to connect and take action, especially in this abuse crisis. This was not a feel-good event, and maybe you're used to better events, like more happy events of International Women's Day of Voices of Faith. So this is a very different issue. And I bow myself deeply, deeply to all of you who came here to raise your voice, to have the courage to speak up on this very difficult issue. Thank you here. Voices of Faith was supposed to be a space where women's voices are heard and where stories are told. But it is a fact that our Catholic leaders do not want to hear our voices and stories. And it saddens me especially when we look at what crisis the Church is in. And some might argue, but the Catholic Church was always in a crisis, and it survived. So why making now a problem out of it? I leave it open, this question. The Fiddle Gates Foundation and Voices of Faith as an initiative is supposed to help the Church to do good. It's saying in its statutes, you help the Catholic Church. Are we doing good in supporting a church that protects perpetrators? Voices of Faith is going at the moment through a reflecting process of what help it can be to the church. Because right now I feel that our help is not wanted. Nevertheless, we have the vision that we want a church that belongs to all of us. And that means, especially, our vision is to put women in leadership and decision-making positions. Voices of Faith is taking steps for change and will speak up where truth is needed, even when it hurts. We are planning to break the silence. So in January 2019, Voices of Faith will launch a global digital campaign that will focus on unsilencing women and highlighting that progress will never be achieved if we remain silent. This campaign will be a catalyst for change, a movement that becomes too loud to ignore. It will uncover stories from all over the world, fighting for the same thing we in this room are today, but on a global level, united in one voice. Women have a role to play in leadership for the future of our church, for its survival, for our daughters. The time for change is now, and we hope all of you will join us in driving this campaign in 2019. We will be sure to keep you posted because we cannot do it alone. So thank you again, everyone, for coming to make this event happen. Thank you again to our storytellers, panelists, Robert, the singers, and finally to my team, which I want you to come to the front, because Voices of Faith is growing, it's getting bigger, we go global. Thank you to Petra, Advocacy Officer. Thank you to Stephanie, Communication, our new General Manager in Rome, and Katja, our Event Manager. Thank you so much. This event and future events will not happen without them. Thank you. And please enjoy aperitivo, and you speakers, you're going to have your glass of wine. Thank you. Thank you.
Chantal, your keynote speaker. We speak the keynote speaker.